Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was a serial killer who became known as the Kansas City Butcher due to his practice of extensively dissecting his victims' bodies. His crimes took place in Kansas City, Missouri, between 1984 and 1987, where he kidnapped, raped, tortured and murdered at least 6 young men after having forced his victims to endure periods of up to 6 weeks of captivity. As a child, Berdella was a loner who rarely played outside his home and seldom had friends. He was also diagnosed with high blood pressure, for which he took several medications. As Berdella's father valued sports and physical education, he viewed his son's lack of interest in sports as a sign of failure, and often compared him unfavorably with his younger brother. Occasionally, Berdella's father physically and emotionally abused his children. When Berdella reached puberty, he realized he was homosexual and kept this fact a closely guarded secret. In his early teens, he briefly had a girlfriend to fit in with his peers. During college, Berdella began spending his free time with male prostitutes, addicts, petty criminals, and runaways. He would befriend and try to help free them from their addictions or criminal lifestyles. Berdella would often engage in sexual relations with them, and would establish a degree of control via methods such as loaning them money and allowing them to live rent-free at his house for periods of time. In 1965, Berdella saw the film The Collector, where a disturbed man stalks and abducts a young woman whom he finds attractive, holding her captive in his basement, and viewing her as little more than an attractive specimen. Berdella later stated this movie had formed a lasting impression on him. Berdella's first known victim was 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Berdella plied him with alcohol, Valium and acepromazine until the youth became unconscious. Howell was restrained to Berdella's bed for a period of approximately 28 hours. Throughout this period of captivity, Berdella repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped and violated him with foreign objects. Howell eventually became asphyxiated on his own vomit, before dragging his body to the basement. He then suspended Howell's body above a large cooking pot and made several incisions to the youth's inner elbows and jugular vein, before leaving the body suspended overnight to allow the blood to drain. The following day, he dismembered Howell's body using a chainsaw and boning knives. As would be the case with all Berdella's murders, he kept a detailed log in which he documented each act of sexual and physical torture inflicted upon his victim. On April 1985, a former acquaintance, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, arrived on Berdella's doorstep, asking if he could again stay for a short period of time. Although not physically attracted to this victim, he chose to hold him captive as punishment when he returned home to find Sheldon intoxicated. Sheldon was drugged and held captive in the second-floor bedroom for 3 days, enduring forms of torture such as the swabbing of drain cleaner in his left eye, the insertion of needles beneath his fingertips, the binding of his wrists with piano wire to permanently damage the nerves in his hands, and filling his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing capacity. 3 days after holding Sheldon captive, a workman came to perform some scheduled work on his home, leading Berdella to fatally suffocate Sheldon by placing a sack over his head, which he then tightened with a piece of rope. The following June, Berdella found his former yard worker, Mark Wallace, hiding in his tool shed to seek shelter from a thunderstorm. Berdella invited him inside his house, and volunteered to inject him with chlorpromazine, with the explanation this would calm down and relax him. Wallace willingly accepted the offer and 30 minutes later, was carried to the second-floor bedroom where he endured almost a day of captivity and torture, including the application of alligator clips to his nipples to facilitate electrical shocks. 1 hour after inserting hypodermic needles into various muscles upon his victim's back, Mark Wallace died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and the lack of oxygen. On September 1985, James Ferris asked to stay at Berdella's home for a short time. Berdella drugged him with crushed tranquilizers he had concealed in a meal, then tied him to his bed before torturing him almost constantly for approximately 27 hours, with his usual electroshock and needle insertions, until the young man died of exhaustion. Todd Stoops was a 23-year-old drug addict and occasional prostitute, who alongside his wife, had twice lived briefly at Berdella's house in 1984. Berdella would later stress to investigators he had been extremely physically attracted to Stoops. After Berdella lured Stoops to his home with money, he was held captive for 2 weeks before he died, with him gradually increasing his captive's terror to make him cooperative. Berdella used electrical shocks through Stoops' closed eyes in an attempt to blind him, and injected drain cleaner in his larynx to try to silence his screaming. By the final day of his captivity, Stoops was so weak he had been unable to breathe in a sitting position, with the addition of septic shock proved fatal. In the spring of 1987, Berdella did not initially intend to capture 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson, until the young man began jokingly referring to his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita. That evening, Berdella ensured Pearson became intoxicated before injecting him with chlorpromazine and moving him down to his basement, where he bound him, before injecting Pearson's larynx with drain cleaner. According to Berdella, Pearson was by far the most cooperative of his 6 murder victims. But after 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson could not take it anymore and bit Berdella's penis so badly, sending Berdella to the hospital. Unfortunately, after Berdella received medical attention, he bludgeoned Pearson to death. On March 1988, Berdella abducted his last victim, a 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson. At Berdella's home, Bryson was knocked unconscious with an iron bar, then bound to Berdella's bed, where he was subjected to similar methods of abuse and torture, although in Bryson's case, Berdella repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia. By the 3rd day of his capture, Bryson had earned sufficient trust from Berdella to persuade him to establish a daily regime of tying his hands in front of him after his sexual abuse. The following day, he managed to break free of his restraints by burning them using matches Berdella had inadvertently left in the room. Bryson managed to escape from the house by jumping from a 2nd-floor window, wearing nothing, breaking a bone in his foot in the process. He then ran toward a parking officer across the street, shouting for this individual to call the police, who arrived minutes later. On the afternoon of Bryson's escape, Berdella was arrested. Prior to the arrest, Berdella had been questioned in relation to missing persons reported, as he was associated with the disappeared individuals. But police had been unable to find any solid evidence, and he refused to talk further without a lawyer present. He would later have his lawyer threaten to file harassment accusations against police unless their questioning and surveillance of him ceased. After his arrest, searching Berdella's house ensued, and investigators uncovered a human skull inside a closet, and a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. The search also uncovered human vertebrae scarred by both hacksaw and knife marks, and several human teeth stowed in 2 envelopes. Both a hacksaw and a miter saw were discovered in the basement, and a chainsaw was also found to be soiled with bloodstains, flesh, and pubic hairs. 334 Polaroid pictures and 34 snapshot prints of various male individuals were also found within Berdella's house. These pictures showed Christopher Bryson and several other men both in life and in death. Despite initially pleading not guilty, Berdella ultimately conducted a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. Berdella agreed to confess in graphic detail as to whom he had killed, what indignities he had subjected each victim, how he had killed each victim, and what he had done with their bodies. In response, Judge Myers imposed 5 further concurrent life sentences, with an additional condition barring any future prospect of parole. In the years following his incarceration, Berdella granted an interview to attempt to restore his image as a sensitive citizen, who had simply made mistakes in committing his crimes. He further claimed he had been demonized unfairly by the media. Berdella also lodged several complaints with prison officials regarding prison conditions. In 1992, Berdella complained to prison staff of severe chest pains. Medical staff determined his heart was unstable, and was pronounced dead at age 43 from a heart attack. In November 1988, Berdella's vast collection of artifacts and furniture, confiscated from his business and house, were held for auction to pay his mounting legal fees. By the end of the first day's auctioneering, more than $60,000 had been raised for this purpose, equivalent to $151,000 in 2023. Berdella's house was purchased by a local businessman for an undisclosed amount in 1988, and the property was later demolished.